Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Omar, for this beautiful introduction. Omar should know everything that he's been talking about because he's been a subscriber ever since the beginning of the magazine. So I'm eternally grateful for your support, Omar. And more generally, I'm very, very grateful to be part of this lecture series. So big thanks to Leslie Hewitt and Omar Berrada for this incredible lecture series. Really, I feel like I'm on Tiny Desk or something. Like yeah, I don't know. I've not even been like hoping to be on it, but now that I am, I'm extremely excited and happy. So let me share my screen and then we will be able to begin. Okay. Well, I suppose Omar already reframed this talk today within a broader context of my work, which really is more dedicated to the making of the phenomenalist. So my cap as an editor. But it's true that this specific talk might be touching upon a little bit more my work as a writer and as a mapper or cartographer. I don't know. It's every I feel editor is the only cap that does not make me have the imposter syndrome. So, but I'll try to I'll try to work through it. But and to give you a little bit more context, and also the new issue we have released as pre-orders and soon to be released officially, which would consist in decentering the US. So also like I think we're also starting with it a new series where we really try to reflect a little bit even deeper on how to think and organize politically. But so yeah, this other activity of mine, which consists in writing and mapping, and also I usually say mapping as a way to sort of complement writing, because I feel, I mean, I don't know how many architects is there in the audience, but I think we're notorious to not write so well. So we can maybe make up for it in having like a visual production. So this is what I've been sort of doing for quite a few years now. But anyway, so the way I'm thinking to organize this talk is first to give you a little bit of the set of the arguments that I'm trying to put forward in this work, in particular in the books that Omar has mentioned. Then really address cartography as a practice and as a methodology, and then perhaps as a short conclusion, also thinking of its shortcomings. So as far as the arguments are concerned, indeed, when it comes to Palestine, they are mostly articulated in those two books. That for the first one is starting to be not so young anymore. I've wrote it 12 years ago, so I cannot open it anymore without cringing. But still, I think when it comes to like the main argument of it, I'm still very attached to it, which is the idea that architecture is inherently violent in the sort of spatial formation it forces on bodies. And of course, this violence is not just like a physical violence. It is instrumentalized politically, and 99% of the time it would be used to reinforce dominant orders of control of bodies. And so also, what do we do with the extra 1% where we manage to reorient this violence against for our own organizing, sorry. And although this first book was very general when it comes to architecture, it was also very specifically attached to the Palestinian context and the way architecture, of course, is a primary tool of settler colonialism in occupied Palestine, and as of course work like Eyal Weizmans have been showing in great details. But so that consists, of course, of many dimensions. The most obvious ones being the apartheid walls, both in the West Bank and Gaza, which is like punctuated by a series of checkpoints of various scales for various means, but and with various temporal scales as well. But that very much corresponds also at if I use an architectural analogy, I'm always attached to the idea of what is a wall, what is a door, what is a lock, what is a key. And so at a territorial scale, of course, the checkpoint is the equivalent of the key in that case. The various colonies, Israeli colonies, both in the West Bank and in 48 Palestine, what is known today as Israel, of course. Those are, of course, very. I have to stop saying, of course. I'm sorry. Those are architectural embodiments that we can think immediately about when we think of the incarnation of settler colonialism in Palestine. But also, and that's what this second book on Palestine, the bulldozer politics, have been more attached to showing, which is the way architecture is also what's being erased when it comes to Palestinian villages in 48 Palestine that has been evicted during the Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, and whose ruins sometimes have been left, as you can see in a few of those instances, whether in Jerusalem, in the Lid, or in Jaffa. But the ruins themselves have been also the target later on in the existence of the State of Israel. Have been destroyed as an architectural testimony of Palestinian pre-existence of the establishment of the State of Israel, and as witness of the violence that founded that colonial state. But also looking, I was talking about the sort of the 1% left of architectures that can reorient this violence towards something else. Looking at the various architectural embodiments that somehow do not quite let themselves be the object of control that architecture tends to be. And so the Palestinian refugee camps, in that case, in Bethlehem, in Ramallah, and in Jerusalem, are particularly illustrative of places that the colonial army has a lot of trouble taming. And of course, when I say places, I mean the people within it, but architecture being somehow less of a constraint and more of an asset for militants. And I'll go back to it in another context in just a minute, which leads me to this last book, which is really like a 5 years work. Like I tend to work a little bit on the surface of things, but and I think this book still does that, because it touches so many things that it indeed works on the surface. And by that, I don't mean to do like a self-depreciating comment. I just meant to say that I'm more of a surface, and maybe that's where cartography comes from as well. Whereas I'm also extremely thankful and admiring people who actually works on the depth, on the great depth of things. But so this this book was maybe a tiny thicker surface than sometimes, and it consisted in through taking as a pretext the colonial history of the French state of emergency, which France is still living under as a permanent state of law now, ever since the Macron administration turned it into common law in 2017. But before that, it had been drafted in 1955 to be immediately adopted to repress extremely violently, I mean, murderously, really, the Algerian Revolution between 1954 and 1962. Has been taken at three occasions during this counter-revolution in Algeria, and more recently in France has been activated in 2005 for those of you who are, I don't know, let's say at least in their 30s, you might remember in 2005 the massive youth revolt in the French banlieue, so the sort of suburban areas were with a high concentration of public housing projects, and where most of the inhabitants are racialized by the French state, and also are somehow most of the time linked, has their family linked to the either the French colonial empire history or another European colonial empire. But so those state of emergency are, well, they were not very well documented. Otherwise, I would probably not have written that book. But they were a little bit more documented than the one in 1985 that happened in Kanaki, which is indigenous name for New Caledonia, which is still today a French settler colony offshore of Brisbane in Australia, if you picture. But I'll have it on a map in a little bit. Where a massive insurrection of indigenous Kanak people almost led to the independence, and still today we're pretty close from it. And so this establishment of the state of emergency was widely undocumented, and so that's also something that the book does. And of course, as much as the book documents the history of those counter-revolutions, they also documents the history of the revolutions themselves, whether in Algeria, in Kanaki, or in the French banlieue. And so, as I mentioned earlier, it looks. I mean, the book in English would be called "States of Emergency: A Spatial History of the French Colonial Continuum." And of course, the spatial part is very much where I think I can bring a little something, and I had very much to think through the question of time as well, which was pretty new for me. But so when it comes to space, look, I was describing earlier the Palestinian refugee camps, but a place like Algiers Kasbah, the old city of Algiers, has been instrumental also as a place where that the French colonial paratroopers could not fully control and could not fully get a grasp on, and which therefore allowed the Algerian National Liberation Front to lead a urban battle, a widely asymmetrical battle, but somehow managed, not so much thanks to architecture, but at least architecture was for once not against the people who lived in it. So that's something that I've been looking at. Similarly in Kanaki, how the use of bridges and more generally roadblocks have been used by Kanak people in order to sever the colonial territory. And in the case of the banlieue as well, like documentations that I've been able to do on, for example, the architecture of the police stations in the banlieue, and the various degrees through which architecture is used as a way to disguise, well, the aesthetics of architecture has been used to disguise what architecture actually does, which is to embody those little medieval bastions that you can see here in a sort of police state fantasy of I don't know, of an upcoming civil war, or just generally the sort of shows just generally the antagonistic and racist dimension of the police in those neighborhoods, in particular vis-a-vis young Black and Arab men. So that was like a very brief overview of the argument themselves. I haven't talked yet of colonial continuum. I will, but I think it's because I'm taking this concept quite literally and quite seriously. I think I need to bring it through a more general considerations on cartography, which is what Omar and Leslie had asked me to do. So also wanted to take that request seriously. And so I think, and that's where Palestine is in a sort of very, I apologize because it's very self-centered, if not autobiographical, but in a way, how in my mapping of Palestine that I've been doing for 12 years now, this led me to think of mapping as a less literal exercise. But so what I will show you first will be rather literal, although this maps that I had done for that I had done for this first book was a little bit less literal, and trying to show something that actually has become relatively commonplace, which is to think of the various areas that the 1994 Oslo Accord, well, 1993 and 1995 Oslo Accords have set up in the context of the West Bank, of the occupied West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority has a relatively limited sovereignty over those little areas that therefore we can see as islands, as part of a bigger sea of occupation. Of course, if we continue this metaphor, there are floods all the time, and so the sea can cover often some of those islands. But that was, I guess, a metaphorical way to talk about the dislocation of Palestinian sovereignty. But of course, this is true at a broader scale of the entire Palestine. I tried each time to zoom a little bit more so that you can see. Similarly, I've done like many maps like that, which tries to document the way, and you know, when I say I here, it's like there's really many people who've been doing this work as well, and before I did, of course, and in particular in Palestine, but so trying to document the spatial dimension of colonialism, and in that case, in the context of Jerusalem itself, and how what is known as East Jerusalem has been of course invaded in 1967 by the Israeli army, including the old city itself, and annexed unofficially immediately and officially in 1980 to Israel. And so the apartheid wall built starting in 2002 has been making sure that the entire eastern part of the city is indeed on the western side of the wall, and now allowed for anyone in the West Bank who doesn't have a permit to cross the wall, and that of course includes the old city and the holy sites within it, and the of course many colonies in East Jerusalem itself as well. I was talking about a broader scale, so it's important to do it at the scale of the entire Palestine, as well as other areas that have been occupied by the Israeli army at some point, or that are still occupied. I mean, I'm thinking of the Sinai in Egypt, South Lebanon for quite a few years as well, and still today the Golan Heights in Syria. and trying to show at various all the various layers of colonialism, whether the colonies themselves, the walls, the checkpoints, the villages, those Palestinian villages that have been destroyed in 1948, and so trying to bring it to a comprehensive map of the entire country. And also, I mean, using the same scale, really. Sometimes also trying to think of what a post-apartheid and a decolonized Palestine would look like, which led to this bilingual map that was exhibited in London a few years back. But you know, that has many problems, I would say. But that was interesting to work through, and as I said, like putting those architectural skills at work, perhaps to envision things. Oops, sorry. So going back now to the French colonial continuum, in terms of mapping and starting to, I mean, this work really forced me to think more about time. So I had done before like some what I call chrono cartography. So trying to have time and space within one document, in particular for showing the way space has been instrumental in the organization of the 1871 Paris Commune. So when the city of Paris became like a sort of proletarian or workers' republic for 3 months against the Third Empire, and was annihilated by the empire's army. But so here the context is other, but at the same scale of Paris, which was trying to make an argument about what is now relatively well known in France as the October 17, 1961 massacre during the Algerian Revolution. Toward the end of the Algerian Revolution, there was a curfew that was taken on the sole persons of Algerians in Paris, and as to disobey this colonial legislation, over 30,000 Algerians marched into Paris, and which was met with an incredible level of brutality, although one that was totally not unusual in the context of Algeria, but that was maybe a little bit more spectacular in the northern part of the Mediterranean. And so that led to the arrest of over 10,000 of them, and the death of tragically we don't actually know, but somewhere between 200 to 200 people were killed that night by the French police, and and so one of the things about this massacre that was one of the official narrative, well, not official really because it was barely acknowledged back then, but one of the ways that the massacre was usually memorialized was thinking of one particular space, which is the Pont Saint-Michel, if you know Paris, in a one particular time, which was that night at a specific moment, which led to sort of belief that the massacre had been like some sort of hot-blooded event that happened that happened in one place in one time. Whereas what I was trying to show through those 25 maps is how the temporality and spatialities of it was multiple, and so there's like 24 of those small maps and this big index 25th map, trying to show those various spatialities and describe the different moments of this massacre, of this colonial massacre. And perhaps trying to keep like a sort of spatial consistency here and lead you towards what would be like the first part of the book, which is on the Algerian Revolution, and the third part of the book, which is about the banlieue uprising. How, of course, those banlieues were had a continuity that were going from the shanty towns of Nanterre in particular, where many Algerians were living, to what is now known as a banlieue, with a public housing and during the 70s and 80s some temporary housing neighborhoods that were highly controlled, and from where a lot of political or anti-racist political organizing has been organized. So those views are meant to also talk about what I call political geology, which is, I was talking about the thicker surface. That's really about taking one space, in particular in Paris. That's something I tend to do in Paris, but taking one space and sort of analyzing the various historical stratas of that space, and how in a few decades this space is intensified politically by the architecture and the people who lived on it. In the context of that research also, it led to some specific maps trying to show some perimeters around like each international port, whether as there are train stations or airports, where anyone can be controlled, have their identity controlled, and searched by the police as a way that is sold again in the whole rhetoric of the state emergency against like terrorism or this kind of thing, but that is that is actually meant to be applied against people who are deemed as potentially foreigner in an undocumented situation. But now taking the scale to a much more global way, and thinking in finally about this concept of colonial continuum, this was for me very, very important to try to be able to represent what I call this colonial continuum. Also, I mean, something I should say is that this phrase colonial continuum, I mean, in French, continuum colonial, is something that is not new. Far from it. It's been used by several politically engaged intellectuals as a way to, but most of the time it would be to mean a very temporal, to make a very temporal argument, which is to say there used to be colonialism, and even though now we don't really think of it, we don't think of the situations, for example, in the banlieue as colonialism, there's some sort of continuity to it that that is deemed, that is worth sort of questioning. But what I thought to be perhaps interesting is to take the concept of continuum in physics quite literally, and bear in mind my understanding of physics is very, very limited, but just enough to know that a continuum is a time-space, a space-time surface. And so those four dimensions are mobilized within that concept. And I think, I wanted to take like this very temporal concept and turn it also into a spatial concept, which of course consists in also mapping the empire itself. So as you can see here, you have, as I was talking about, you have Kanaki that is situated there, and how still today, be it Kanaki, Réunion, Mayotte, which is one of the islands of the Comoros that is still occupied by France, in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Martin, Guyana, are still French colonies today. So not to forget that is either. But still, like this mapping was still a very literal, and I should say Tahiti Nui as well. This mapping was still a very literal and geographical understanding of this colonial continuum. So I wanted to take it further, and also as doing some things that perhaps in a broader global context is not quite as talkative as or not quite as illustrative, let's say, as it would be in the French context. But those are public servant, like high function public servants, ministers, military officers, who are serving in those various colonial geographies, whether historically. I mean, the people who are on the left are, I think, for most of them, dead now, and they've been serving perhaps more in the 60s and 70s, being the colonial administrator of Martinique, and then moved to Kanaki, and then moved back to France, and are usually administrators of prefectures, with a high concentration of public housing, for example. So you have all those sort of colonial skills that are acquired by those different people, and who are reusing it in various contexts, including in contexts that are usually not perceived as colonial. So that's another way, I suppose, to map this colonial continuum. And then perhaps for the most complex mapping, but that brings a higher level of complexity, which actually take us to an interesting place, to perhaps see some connections that we would have missed otherwise. I mean, I show this photo because this is actually what gave me the idea of mapping it like that. This is like this is a graph that is used for in a factory for the to map the degree of humidity within the factory, to be able to be in control of this humidity on the scale of 1 week. So you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc. And so that led me to think of the entire space-time cartography of the book with this map that shows those three spaces of Algeria, France, and Kanaki, as well as other spaces in the periphery of this circle. And so I don't know if you're going to be able to see, but basically each of those dots are like one event within the book, and to show how, I mean, Algeria and France, I suppose, are only separated by a part of the Mediterranean Sea. So at the end of the day, they're not that far apart, but here they really touch each other. Like there's only this line separating them. And Kanaki is actually 17,000 kilometers away from France, but somehow the colonial condition links it to it would not be visible if we're dealing only with a geographical mapping. So this way, space-time surface where dots that were deemed as distant are actually can be seen in a much more in contact. And those red areas you see are the various sort of moments of the state emergency or affiliates of the state emergency. I mean, there was also 2 moments during the Algerian revolutions where President de Gaulle took the full executive and legislative power. Because also something that should be said is that France is still living in its 5th republic, and the 5th republic was drafted, like the 5th constitution was drafted in the middle of the Algerian revolution, or rather the counter-revolution in Algeria. And so this way of mapping space-time together although perhaps from a perhaps from the way you see it right now, especially I don't know whether you're able to read or not, might seem a little bit too obscure and complex to make sense, and perhaps I hope doesn't read as facetious, but I could also understand how it would from a distant point of view. But if somehow I would send you the PDF of this thing, I think it would make much more sense to connect those dots quite literally. And so, but really, I mean, this is still like a very two-dimensional I mean, it is four-dimensional insofar as that there's space and time connected, but the way it's shown, it's still very two-dimensional, and somehow I almost wanted to follow this to let my inspiration by this study model by Lambert, an artist, to go even further. And so I mean, in that case, it is facetious. Like I was not able to control very well what I was doing here, but I wanted to suggest the idea that there is really a topological dimension to this continuum, and how this surface is really even the model, the cartographing of this space-time surface could be seen in 3D as far as the cartography is concerned. So I mean, for the purpose of today's talk, I really wanted to try to do the same thing in the context of Palestine, which led to this map, which I think is widely unachieved for the moment. I mean, not that any of those maps would ever be achieved anyway, but I think yeah, I tried to bring it as far as I could for today. Which with the various sort of spatial dimension of Palestine itself, whether in Palestine with Jerusalem, the West Bank, 48 Palestine, and Gaza, but also the refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and of course the many other geographies of the diaspora, and the way the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PFL, or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, have been organizing from. Of course, Beirut, but also Cairo, Tunis, Algiers. Also seeing how, in the case of Palestine, like those spaces are actually geographically connected, which I guess makes it even more obvious to put them together, but perhaps creates a little bit less or less interesting things than connecting like the space of France and Kanaki, for example, but that also allowed to show the separation between them, like the apartheid wall construction. So you can see those thick lines on the left as being like more recent attempt to control territory. And something I should have said on the first map as well is this map is also not thinking of time as linear, or thinking of time as at least uniform, and trying to think of some moments, for example, like in the history of in the recent history of Palestine, of course, a year like 1948, the year of the Nakba, would very obviously take much more space in such a map than, let's say, the year of 1950, or even more so the year of 1946, and so that this ability to extend or stretch time in this cartography, for me, is a very important methodological tool that, of course, is not meant to how to say that is not meant to say that nothing happened in 1946 or anything like that, but from a strict methodological point of view, to show how sometimes a year, a month, or even a day, I talked about the October 17, 1961 massacre in the case of the Algerian Revolution. Sometimes a day can have even more weight on history than an entire year at another time. So that's a way to also try to work on this, and in that case to show not only the Nakba but the Naksa, which is the 1967. So 6 days in that case, 6 days that takes a lot of room here. the invasion by the Israeli army of Jerusalem, of the West Bank, of Gaza, of the Sinai, and of the Golan Heights, and also showing the first Intifada, the second Intifada, gives more space to Gaza in the case of the first Intifada, give more space to the West Bank in the case of the second Intifada, or this kind of things, which, you know, well, I guess I'll get to the shortcomings in just a moment. But also, interestingly enough, I think it's important to take those two maps and to see where they also connect, because, you know, France is not separated. The French colonial continuum overlaps in the colonial history of occupied Palestine in many ways. Of course, we can go as far as also talking about the history of European anti-Semitism, and in particular the French one, which led also to a sort of the legitimation of Zionism in many ways, and not just in a sort of not sort of in a benevolent way, but quite as a Zionism supports in Europe as also as an anti-Semitic endeavor, also from non-Jewish institutions, as a way to also, yeah, I mean, anyway, but also much more operationally how the French military and the Israeli militaries have been collaborating, how in the context of the Algerian counter-revolution in Algeria as well, 2 million people have been evicted from their villages and put into camps in Algeria, which is only, you know, like 6 years, or from 6 to 10 years after the Nakba, where 750,000 Palestinians have been evicted and turned into refugees by Zionist paramilitary groups. So there's many overlaps. I mean, I suppose this slide is not really showing those overlaps, because we see two very distinct maps, because I haven't done that work. But there's many ways in which those two maps would be able to sort of like merge at some point, and give us an additional layer of information that perhaps, I mean, you know, I'm sure text is able to do that, but somehow, if for the visual person that we might be, many of us over here, this can be helpful. Anyways, that leads me to my conclusion, which are talking about the shortcomings of the map, that after so many maps shown on screen are important to point out. One is the finite dimension of the map, and how, similarly to the way we tend to practice history, we tend to like start it somewhere and end it somewhere, leaving out this continuum dimension of things, how things, you know, there's no limit to the continuum. A continuum is just like like I think if we were really able to honor almost this concept and the complexity of political reality, we should always be thinking of concepts such as simultaneity, when it comes to time. So what is happening? I mean, that's been the amazing thing, reading like newspapers from the different moments, the different space times that I've been studying for this book, is seeing how, I don't know, for example, how the second putsch in Algeria by French colonial officers in 1961 happened just a few days after the CIA invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. So to try to connect those dots that do not seem also connected at first, and I think the maps that I've been showing you doesn't quite honor this simultaneity, because somehow the sort of peripheral rest of the world dimension of things is very limited. So I think that's something that maps unfortunately tend to do, although that's not a fatality. Maps, of course, are always, I mean, it's always crucial to wonder what are we mapping and to whom is it useful? And sometimes I feel that I've been seeing some cartographic endeavors that might be actually more useful to control than to actually document colonialism, for example. And here I don't want to fall into the trap of saying like, well, what we do is not mapping, it's counter mapping. And I think it's always a little bit it's a bit convenient to sort of give ourselves the sort of terms that would immediately take us out from those shortcomings and like say, well, we're not mapping, we're counter mapping. So I think, you know, I mean, I'm thinking of one example in particular. I remember like a group of architects in the Netherlands that had been mapping sex workers spaces in the city, which I thought was, you know, I mean, let aside the sort of the sex working frameworks within the Netherlands itself, but was a way to was not going to be politically useful to the people it was mapping, and quite on the contrary, could actually put them in harm's way. So that's always a shortcoming to be careful with. Similarly, I mean, too machinistic, if not militaristic. I mean, I think that's this dimension I just talked about, but also, you know, those maps I showed you are they seem like very scientific, like they seem very controlled, and in many ways they are. I mean, I've even used some. I mean, the maps themselves were done for those of you who would know, they were done in Rhino with the use of Grasshopper and like with sort of like automated rules that would sort of that would give it like a sort of scientific dimension, but actually a lot of it is very is not at all like scientific and very interpretative, and somehow they do not really reflect that, so that could be a problem. And so to those three shortcomings, I have a fourth one, but to those three, I want to also give you an insight of what kind of cartographic practice actually might address those problems and might do it in such an amazing way. And I'm still unbelievably admiring of this practice, which is Chimaranga maps, the many maps that as this Cape Town a group of researchers, writers, editors, artists, musicians have been doing over the time, and how in that case, you know, with just hand drawing, are managing to make like entire imaginary. I mean, most of the time Pan-African imaginaries become much more real, and doing those connections that I was talking about, but in such a simple yet potent way that I personally have never been able to reach. So I'm always like incredibly in awe, really. I mean, those photos are from an exhibition that Chimaranga did in Paris, and I've spent like I forgot how many hours in front of them, and it's just absolutely amazing. And perhaps one last shortcoming, and very massive one, is how maps tend to de-incarnate the political realities they are showing because of this like very top-down. I mean, whether we are literal about it and therefore this sort of top-down geographical maps or other maps, but still, it's very hard to account for the incarnation of the violence that is shown, or all the resistance that is shown in those maps. And so, and you know, in the case of Palestine, we've seen that all too much. Like we've seen so many people mapping the condition of settler colonialism, but somehow it only works for his storybooks. Like it doesn't work. Like it does not quite relate the texture of the metal of the checkpoint of Kalandia that Palestinian workers have to cross through every day at 4 a.m. Like somehow maps are completely missing this dimension. Not that they should have it, but because I don't think maps should actually be omnipotent tools, but that just to say that I think using maps without this sort of incarnated account is a huge problem of and tells a lot about the person who is doing that. And so I think I want to finish with actually bringing back the incarnation of things on the ground, and also ultimately wonder what is it for we're doing that. Is it for the sole purpose of research, which could be possibly argued, but as far as I'm concerned, also as an independent researcher, I'm not an academic in any way. I think the ultimate question is that useful to people fighting on the ground? And if not, then perhaps find other means. And if it is in its own little humble way, then still trying to find like even better ways to account for these complexities that Leslie was talking about in her introduction. Yeah, but anyway, I think I'm going to stop here, and I very purposely use those shortcomings as conclusion to open the conversation, to already perhaps orient a little bit the questions towards what maps can and cannot do. So thank you very much for your attention.